There have been over 1,000 articles that have been published on components of personality, and most of these were from the time period in the 60s and 70s. Some of this research was fundamental, whereby researchers sought to understand sports behavior in general. Likewise, during this time, personality became a major aspect of study. Have you ever tried to define personality? Most of the time we use adjectives, or maybe we think of how we typically respond as an indicator of our personality. Many have attempted to define personality, but most agree that uniqueness is the only word used that seems to be one that we can all agree upon. For us here, we will describe personality as a blend of characteristics that make a person unique. When we consider personality and sport, we have to understand that there are three separate but related levels. They would be the psychological core, our typical responses, and role-related behavior. The most basic level of understanding personality is rooted in the psychological core, and this is the deepest component of personality. This would include our attitudes, values, our interests, and our motives. This would also be the belief set within the person about themselves and their self-worth. The centerpiece of our personality is the real you, not what you want others to think about you. The second way that we try to define personality is by trying to understand our typical responses. Typical responses are the way that we learn to adapt or adjust to the environment around us and how we usually respond to the world. Typically, these are good indicators of what our psychological core is as well. The third component of defining personality is what we call role-related behaviors, and this is basically how we act based on how we perceive our social situation. This is also one of the most modifiable aspects of our personality, and behavior changes are based on our perceptions of the situations that we find ourselves in within our environment. So different situations might require that we assume different roles. To better help us understand personality structure, we have to understand that the three levels of personality that we just described encompass a continuum from those behaviors that are internally driven to those that are externally driven. Our psychological core is the most internal of the three levels and is the hardest for us to get to know. But it is the most stable part of our personality. This part of our personality remains stable and constant over time. On the other end of the continuum, the most external would be the role-related behaviors, which are really subject to the greatest influence from within external motivators. And usually our personality responses will lie somewhere in between what we present in our psychological core and our role-related behaviors, because they can result from the interaction or interplay of the psychological core and our role-related behaviors. In sport, some stability as well as some adaptability are desirable for personality. So we rely on our core to provide the structure that we need to function effectively in society and also in sport, whereas in a dynamic sense, both stability and change are desirable attributes in sport. So the core, the most stable aspect of our personality, provides structure and allows us to function effectively in society and can also be viewed for how it contributes this sort of trait to sport. Whereas the dynamic aspect allows for change and learning and adaptability that go beyond the role-related behaviors in a particular situation. When we have been able to figure out the personality structure of someone that we're working with, or even collectively as a team, we can better understand motivations. We can also understand how their personality will affect their performance in sport and how participation in sport will in turn develop their character. Now we'll take a look at some of the different approaches that are used to understand personality from 5 different viewpoints and how to measure personality. We'll now look at 5 different viewpoints that are used to, in general, study personality. They include the psychodynamic approach, the trait approach, the situational approach, the interactional approach, and phenomenological approaches. First up is the psychodynamic approach. This is characterized by 2 themes. First, it places emphasis on the unconscious determinants of behavior, such as what Freud called the id, or instinctive drives, and how these can conflict with the more conscious aspects of our personality. such as the superego or one's moral conscious, or the ego, which is the conscious personality. Secondly, this approach focuses on understanding the person as a whole rather than identifying isolated traits or dispositions. Special emphasis is placed on how adult personality is shaped by the resolution of conflicts between the unconscious forces and the values and conscious of the superego in childhood. Although these beliefs had a significant impact on the field of psychology, there was very little application to sport. The key contribution of this approach is the recognition that not all behavior of an exerciser or athlete is under conscious control, and that at times it can be appropriate to focus on unconscious determinants of behavior. The trait approach assumes that traits are relatively stable. And that means personality traits are enduring and consistent across a variety of situations. When considering the trait approach, psychologists consider that the causes of behavior generally reside within the person and that the role of situational or environmental factors is minimal. Traits are considered to predispose a person to act in a certain way depending on the situation or environment. Understanding predisposition does not guarantee that we can predict behavior, but it simply means that the athlete or exerciser is most likely to be competitive in sport situations. However, the trait approach does not consider the particular situations that exercisers may find themselves in. An example of the trait approach would consider people who are conscientious being more motivated toward order or self-discipline and dutifulness, with high levels of neuroticism also seen. These particular persons, by virtue of their traits, would generally be more vulnerable and self-conscious. Some trait theorists argue the best way to understand personality is by considering traits that are relatively enduring and stable over time. As an example, some people anger very easily during sport activity, whereas others seldom get angry at all. But just like other approaches, knowing an individual's traits does not necessarily act as a predictor for how he or she will act in a sport or exercise environment. This has led some researchers to further study personality by focusing on situations or the environment that might trigger behaviors rather than on personality traits alone. As the name implies, the situation approach argues that behavior is determined largely by the situation or environment that an exerciser or athlete finds themselves in. It draws from social learning theory and explains behavior in terms of observational learning and social reinforcement. As an example, you may act confident in one situation but reluctant or tentative in another, regardless of your personality traits. If the influence is strong enough, the effect of personality traits is minimal. If you are introverted and shy, you might still act assertively or aggressively if you see someone needing help because they're in danger. Some researchers have contended that you can influence behavior in sport and physical education by changing the reinforcements in the environment. However, the situation approach, like the trait approach, cannot truly predict behavior either. A situation can certainly influence one's behavior, but other people will not be swayed by the same situation. The interactional approach considers the situation and person as co-determinants of behavior. In other words, these variables come together to help determine and define behavior. Therefore, knowing an individual's psychological traits and the particular situation is helpful in understanding behavior. Personal traits and situational factors independently determine behavior, but at times they interact or mix with each other in unique ways to influence behavior. A person with high hostility won't necessarily be violent in all situations. However, when the hostile person is placed in the right potentially violent situation, his violent nature may be triggered. The overwhelming majority of contemporary sport and exercise psychologists favor the interactional approach to studying behavior because it takes into account the interplay or interaction between the different approaches. Some research has found that interaction between persons and situations could explain twice as many behaviors as traits or situations alone. Using this approach would involve someone examining a person's understanding and interpretation of him or herself and their environment. Therefore, the individual's subjective experiences and personal views of the world and of him or herself are seen as really vital. Most prominent contemporary theories used in sports psychology lie within this framework. As an example, theories of motivation like cognitive evaluation theory or even goal orientation theory and social cognitive theories focus on characteristics associated with athletic success. and these fall within the phenomenological approach. To summarize these different approaches, all 5 are viewpoints that differ in several important ways. First, they vary along a continuum of behavior determination ranging from the view that behavior is determined by a person's internal characteristics to the view that behavior is determined by a situation or the environment. They also vary greatly in terms of assumptions about the origins of human behavior and whether or not behavior is determined by fixed traits or by conscious or subconscious determinants. All of these developments have played an important role in our understanding of sports psychology. It is also useful to measure personality, and when research is conducted appropriately, it can shed considerable light on how personality affects behavior in sport and exercise environments. Research within the field has developed ways to measure personality that can help us understand traits and states. Some distinguish between an individual's typical style of behaving, or their traits, and the situation's effect on behavior, which would be the states. Even though a given psychological trait predisposes someone to behave in a certain way, the behavior doesn't necessarily occur in all situations. In your textbook, some trait sport confidence and state sport confidence inventories are provided. Upon looking at these particular questionnaires, you'll see differences between trait and state measures of confidence in a sport context. The trait sport confidence inventory will ask you to indicate how you generally or typically feel, whereas the state sport confidence inventory will ask you to indicate how you feel right now. Sometimes general scales or questionnaires can give us useful information, but we may need more specific measures to understand personality. Situation-specific measures predict behavior in a more reliable pattern for given situations because they consider both the personality of the player or participant and the specific situation. We can predict behavior better when we have more knowledge of the specific situation and the ways that individuals respond to particular types of situations or environments. On the other hand, we have sport-specific measures. This measure of personality can predict behavior in sport better than general personality tests. Until recently, almost all of the trait and state measures of personality in sports psychology came from general psychological inventories. Now, sport-specific tests provide more reliable and valid measures of personality traits and states in sport and exercise contexts. A sport-specific test of anxiety assesses pre-contemplative anxiety better than a general anxiety test does, as an example. Furthermore, some tests have been developed even for particular sports, and these inventories can help identify a person's areas of psychological strength and weaknesses in that sport or given physical activity. After compiling results from these sort of tests, a coach can advise players on how to build on their strengths and reduce or eliminate their weaknesses. Lastly, we have to consider fluctuations before and during competition. Fluctuations before and during competition are also useful for us to understand, because feelings can change before and during competition. Typically, within a 30-minute time frame of an event, the athlete or participant's state is assessed. In this way, the measurement is the feelings of that moment, but they can change during competition. We need to consider such fluctuations in evaluating personality and reactions to competitive settings. It is vital for a coach to understand personality and how to measure it. You may try to use psychological tests in a general manner to assess the personality of players or participants in sport or physical activity. However, these particular tests or inventories alone cannot actually predict athletic success. When using psychological tests in a general fashion, there are some important questions for you to ask before proceeding. Should these tests be used to help select teams? What qualifies a coach to administer such tests? Should coaches be allowed to administer these psychological tests to their players or participants? What types of tests should be used? In the mid-'80s, the American Psychological Association, or APA, provided 7 helpful guidelines on the use of psychological tests. We will explain these in the following section. The first one is to know the principles of testing and measurement error. So before you administer any psychological test, you should understand testing principles and be able to recognize measurement errors and have well-designed and validated measures. Not all of these tests have been systemically developed and made to be reliable. So making predictions or drawing inferences about an athlete's behavior and personality would be misleading or unethical. Test results can never be viewed as absolute or irrefutable. Even valid tests can have measurement errors. Consider that people will sometimes answer questions in what they think is a socially desirable way, and this is a response style known as faking good. For example, an athlete might skew her answers in a pre-competitive anxiety test to try to appear calm, cool, and collected for the coach. Again, the APA recommends that people administering tests be aware of the limitations of their training and preparation. Some people don't recognize the limits of their knowledge and interpret test results unethically. It's also inappropriate to give physical education students a clinical personality test. It is not advisable for coaches to use psychological tests for team selection. This is considered an abuse because the tests are not accurate enough to be predictive. Some psychological tests may have a limited use, but they must be considered in conjunction with physical performance measures, coach evaluations, and the actual levels of play seen within the players or the individual. 3 key conditions should always be kept in mind. First, the test must be a valid and reliable measure. Next, the user must know what personality characteristics are key for success in the sport of interest. Thirdly, the user should know how much athletes can compensate in some characteristics for the lack of others. Before actually administering or completing tests, anyone taking a psychological test should be told the purpose of the test and what's being measured, and how the test is going to be used. Players or participants should always receive feedback specific to the results to help them gain insight from the testing process. As part of this process, a coach must emphasize confidentiality. This is essential to assure people that their answers will be kept in confidence. Test takers are therefore more likely to answer questions more truthfully. When someone fears exposure, they may fake or falsify their answers. If they are not explained the reasons for testing, test takers typically become suspicious and wonder if the coach will use the test to help select starters or to weed out players. It is often a mistake to compare an athlete's psychological test results with norms, even though in some cases such a comparison might be useful. Players or athletes might score high or low in different measures such as anxiety or self-confidence, but the more critical point is how they are feeling relative to how they usually feel, which is considered the intra-individual approach. It is ideal to use this information to help them perform better and to enjoy the experience more, but relative to only their own standards and not that of others. An example would be to assess a player or exerciser's motivation. It isn't as important to know whether the individual's motivation to exercise is high or low as much as how it compares with competing motivations the exerciser has, including wanting to be with family or carrying out job responsibilities that conflict with the activity. Understanding athletes' or players' personality provides you with some perspective for using and interpreting psychological tests. To measure someone's personality, you would certainly be interested in understanding what their psychological core is, so specific test types to gain an accurate understanding of this would be useful. To measure more subconscious and deeper aspects of personality, consider the use of projective tests. These are tests that usually include pictures or written situations, and test takers are asked to project their feelings. While these particular tests are interesting, they often prove to be difficult to score and interpret. Therefore, some psychologists or coaches usually assess personality in sport by looking at typical responses invoked by the actual situation they are interested in. We will now turn our focus to the research on personality, sport performance, and sport preference. First off, we'll consider athletes versus non-athletes. Now try to define an athlete. What do you come up with? Keep this ambiguity in mind as you read about studies that have compared personality traits of athletes and non-athletes. Such ambiguity in definitions has weakened the research and clouded its interpretation. No single personality profile has been found that distinguishes athletes from non-athletes. However, when athletes were categorized by sport, several differences did emerge. Athletes who played team sports exhibited less abstract reasoning, more introversion, more dependency, and less ego strength. Compared with non-athletes, athletes who played individual sports displayed higher levels of objectivity, more dependency, and less anxiety. Some research has found that team sport athletes were more dependent, extroverted, and anxious, but less imaginative than individual sport athletes. The reasons for these differences remain unclear, and it is most likely that more research is needed to further understand this better. When researching personality profiles among women athletes, it's important to remember that there are marked differences from the normative female in terms of personality profiles. Female athletes are more achievement-oriented, independent, aggressive, emotionally stable, and assertive. And most of these traits are desirable for sport. Some research has focused on comparing personality traits of more successful athletes with those who are considered to be less successful, and use a measure called the profile of mood states. One such study has attempted to understand the behavior and personality of successful elite athletes in a variety of sports. These behaviors are characterized by what has been called the iceberg profile, which reflects positive mental health. The iceberg profile of a successful athlete shows vigor above the mean of the population, but tension, depression, anger, fatigue, and confusion below the mean of the population. The profile looks like an iceberg in that all the negative traits are below the surface, and one positive trait is above the surface. Furthermore, some research has concluded that more successful athletes exhibit the iceberg profile and more positive mental health than those who are less successful. Many sports psychologists oppose using psychological tests for team selection, and in fact, some researchers do not think that the test should be used for selection purposes in any way. Tests can help identify an athlete's psychological strengths and weaknesses, and this information can then be used to develop appropriate training in psychological skills. Some researchers believe that optimal mood profiles are most likely sport-dependent. Therefore, mood changes in athletes should be compared with their own previous mood levels and not with large group norms. The iceberg profile research clearly has implications for professional practice, and this type of data is useful because it can help sports psychologists discover the kinds of psychological traits and states associated with successful athletes. And once these factors are understood, athletes and players can work with a sports psychologist or a coach to develop psychological skills for improving performance. Now let's talk about exercise and personality and review the relationship between exercise and two personality dispositions, type A and self-concept. Type A behavior is characterized by a strong sense of urgency, an excess of competitive drive, and an easily aroused hostility. Causes of type A behavior have not been conclusively determined. Considerable evidence does, however, point to the socio-cultural environment, such as the parental expectations of high standards in performance, as the most likely origin. Self-concept is different in that exercise appears to have a positive relationship with self-concept. Some research has suggested that these changes in self-concept seen with exercise might be associated with the perception of increased fitness levels rather than what has actually changed in terms of physical fitness. Exercise programs seem to lead to significant increases in self-esteem, especially with subjects or participants who initially show low self-esteem. In an attempt to understand the difference between athletes and players who are successful versus those who are less than successful, in-depth interview techniques have been developed for sports psychology coaches. These in-depth interview techniques have become useful as we seek to examine cognitive strategies that are seen among athletes who tend to be more successful. The purpose here is to investigate the differences between successful and less successful athletes by taking what is known as a qualitative approach. In-depth interviews probe the coping strategies that athletes use before and during competition. This can provide coaches or athletes and sports psychologists with much more in-depth personality profiles of an athlete than do paper and pencil tests that have been described before. Another cognitive strategy used to understand success is mental planning. For instance, this would mean an athlete or a team learning a systemic series of mental strategies to use before and during competition, including refocusing plans as an example. Thus, they come prepared mentally not only to perform but to handle distractions and unforeseen events. This can also help athletes whose sense of control is low. This plan will also allow them to feel more in control regardless of situational influences. To summarize here, we have to understand the role of the sports psychology coach in understanding personality. And now that we have learned a little bit about how to study personality in sport and exercise settings, you can understand how to use the information to better understand the individuals in your classes and on your teams. Some points to remember would be to consider both personality traits and situations, and to also be an informed consumer, to know how and when to use personality tests. It's also useful to be a good communicator. In addition to that, try to be a good observer. This is the best way to hypothesize and test personality. Be knowledgeable about mental strategies. Be aware and implement these strategies appropriately in your programs, selecting them specifically to either benefit an individual or a group or team environment.